I want to do something here I haven't done before. I want to do a response video. And of course, I don't ever expect Owen to see this, but I was somewhat surprised and pleased to see Owen Cook on Timcast, who is apparently old Murphy's replacement. If you don't know about Owen, he's been online for a very long time. He started his career as an evil pickup artist. But if you can think back to what it was like being in your early to mid-20s, I think a lot of us were surprised and pleased to learn that you can get very positive reactions from women if you can make confident eye contact and carry on a normal conversation. By the way, now that Jack is out of the business, that will be $100 a month. For those of you that didn't know that, you're welcome. But he's grown, like most of us, over a period of 20 years into a much more interesting character whose focus is on individual personal growth. And I found a lot of his lessons helpful, since what I do here is public speaking and attempting to communicate to an audience of sometimes hundreds and occasionally thousands of viewers. Now, whether Owen sees this or not is irrelevant, because what he raised was a very important question. He says, I deal with individual growth, where we have a person take massive action to get out of certain habits and ways of thinking. In order to really change a person, you can get people out of a funk, or maybe better, out of their shell. Sometimes the transformations are very impressive, and they happen like you're talking a matter of minutes. I've seen him turn around a very closed, introverted person into someone who's outgoing, and you just see them bloom into this social, vibrant person, and it's really amazing to watch. And so he asked the very normal question, and the question I think I grapple with every day on this channel. What can the average person do in the face of the problems we see today, in the face of the incredible evils perpetrated by the ruling class, the massive amount of lying and deception, and the rise of authoritarianism, the gaslighting on Antifa and Black Lives Matter and all of that? He cited a concern, Tim Pool has talked about this a lot, of civil war. Now, I'm less concerned about civil war because I think it would be over in an afternoon, at least if it was the sort of left-right lining up on different halves of a field and going at it. We know how that would play out. I think really the bigger concern is the rise of an authoritarian state, which is what we're actually seeing, say, in places like Germany and Australia, as we see our hard-won freedoms taken away and the division of powers basically ignored in favor of executive decree. So to Owen's question, what can the average person hearing this do? Well, I would submit to you, I am the average person. I get up every day at 4:30 in the morning. I work 40, 50 hours in the office. I bring home about $200, and I'm so exhausted, I just lay on my living room floor sometimes, get up, make dinner, get cleaned up, have an hour or so to myself, and then it's back to bed so that I can go work again. I started out at my facility picking up the garbage and mowing the grass, worked my way to driving lawnmowers, then driving forklifts, and now I work in an office where I'm under the threat of Biden's attack on us every single day, and it's been really awful. But I am that average person. So I decided to begin taking action around the time I saw Alex Jones banned, not because I think he's some avatar of perfection, but people shouldn't have their ability to speak freely taken away. And I didn't know a thing about making videos, so what was it, 4 years ago or something? I just began narrating Aesop's fables, little common fables. Then I branched out to philosophy that I found more interesting, and then began the application of the search for truth to current events. And I think I've improved a great deal since then. Maybe you think I still suck, but I'm a heck of a lot better than I was. And so to provide a blueprint as to how an individual can push back against authoritarianism, I would recommend a book. And it's a book I've narrated on this channel called Dictatorship to Democracy by Gene Sharp. I'm not a professional narrator, as you can tell, but It's probably a 2-hour read. It's a pretty short book. And what the author did was take a look at step-by-step approaches that powerless individuals have taken in order to topple or at least restrain the power of the dictatorships they live under. And I think that's the ultimate goal that we're dealing with here in America, is we want to restrain the government to a point that's the best case. Restrain the government to a point where they can't just trample on our freedoms at will, which of course was the purpose of the Constitution as laid out by the Founding Fathers. And so firstly, you have to ask yourself a question that is one of the chapters in Dictatorship to Democracy. It's called, Whence Comes the Power? Now, I've cited this often, so I'll try not to bore those of you that do listen regularly. But in this chapter, Gene Sharp uses the example of what's called the monkey master fable. So in this story, there's a monkey master. He's an old man in 14th century China, and he survived by keeping monkeys in his service. Each morning, the old man would assemble the monkeys in his courtyard and order the eldest one to lead the others to the mountains to gather fruits. It was the rule that each monkey had to give 1/10 of his collection to the old man. Those who failed to do so would be ruthlessly flogged. All the monkeys suffered bitterly, but dared not complain. One day, a small monkey asked the other monkeys, "Did the old man plant all the fruit trees and bushes?" The other said, "No, they grew naturally." The small monkey further asked, "Can't we take the fruits without the old man's permission?" The others replied, "Yes, we all can." The small monkey continued, "Then why should we depend on the old man? Why must we all serve him?" Before the small monkey was able to finish his statement, all the monkeys suddenly became enlightened and awakened. On the same night, watching that the old man had fallen asleep, the monkeys tore down all the barricades of the stockade in which they were confined and destroyed the stockade entirely. They also took the fruits the old man had in storage, brought them all into the woods, and never returned. The old man finally died of starvation. And at the end of the story is the saying, "Some men in the world rule their people by tricks and not by righteous principles. Aren't they just like the monkey master? They are not aware of their muddle-headedness. As soon as their people become enlightened, their tricks no longer work." Now, Gene Sharp goes on to discuss and delineate the necessary sources of political power. He says the principle is simple. Dictators require the assistance of the people they rule, without which they cannot secure and maintain the sources of political power. This includes things like the belief that they have the authority to rule, the persons and groups which are obeying and cooperating with them, the skills and knowledge needed to govern, intangible psychological factors, and the control they have over property, material resources, and then the punishments that they can inflict. All of these sources, however, depend on acceptance of the regime, on the submission and obedience of the population, and on the cooperation of innumerable people and the many institutions of the society. These are not guaranteed. So the idea is the power capacity of any government ebbs and flows, and it depends on the cooperation and obedience of these needed sources of power, institutions, and so forth. To give an example, I think we can all agree that the Bush-Cheney war in Iraq was an absolute catastrophe. But how did they get it done? Well, they had a lot of support in the media. That institution that pushed information to the people made it possible, and you can see in the Haaretz, they make the argument, the war in Iraq was conceived by 25 neoconservative intellectuals, most of them Jews, who are pushing President Bush to change the course of history. Two of them were William Kristol and Charles Krauthammer, who made frequent television appearances and have a great deal of media influence. But think about that. It seemed like this enormous, unassailable institution that made all of that happen, but the argument here is that it was only 25 men. Now, what if there had been parallel institutions? What if there had been a Timcast back then, reaching more people than CNN or Bill Kristol ever could? actually asking the hard questions about WMDs and keeping, say, Colin Powell's feet to the fire. You see, it wouldn't have happened. This is one of the things people can do, is build up parallel institutions. They can also infiltrate what I call compromised institutions, because most of the institutions aren't fully corrupted. They're just partially compromised, particularly at the top. And so you can counter-infiltrate these institutions, and for a lot of people that just means going to your job every day. We've seen oath keepers infiltrating police departments. We've seen in other militia groups, including the military, get people in rank, get people in positions of power simply by doing their job and being patriotic and loyal to the United States and our primary value of freedom. They can begin to wield influence that can keep, say, 25 intellectuals from imposing their will on the world. Furthermore, this is why the FBI was activated to go after parents protesting critical race theory, because these seemingly monolithic structures of political power are full of holes. It's hard to believe, but this sort of political power is actually much more fragile than it appears. Just look at the latest CDC guidelines, which they based on what they thought people would tolerate, rather than, of course, the science. Like, really think about that. There's really only a handful of key individuals and a lot of people that are just carrying out orders, whether out of fear or ignorance or hoping to get some sort of reward. So while it does seem insignificant at a certain level, it really isn't when an individual can take local level political action. They can begin to provide influence against that top-down power. And it does require more than one person, because, you can get one guy to boost his confidence over the course of an evening. Changing a society that's maybe going down the wrong path that we can all see is a little bit more like turning an aircraft carrier around. It's going to take a lot more time and effort, as well as education, as we are all kind of learning the difference between effective and symbolic action. But as we can see from the recovery from communism from many, many countries around the world, it is possible. So the average person can help build up or support new competing institutions, as I would say Timcast is a competitor to CNN. And by the way, I did a video called What Woke You Up, and more than one person has told me it's actually Tim Pool that did wake them up. They can also begin taking more active roles in leadership in their own life, and however that presents itself, whether it's a school board or a union hall or whatever. That is the counter-infiltration of compromised institutions. I know where I work, there's maybe 25% of us that are kind of in the know, and we're constantly making jokes about conspiracy theories or talking about news stories we know other people haven't heard, and it simply piques their interest. They're like, what are you talking about? And so we have this in-group, but it's all done in a spirit of fun rather than browbeating people, which then encourages them to do the most dangerous thing in the world, which is do your own research. And lastly, as for myself, I realized I work full-time. I don't have a lot of time to make content, and that my reach was going to be limited. So I began thinking, how can I amplify my own reach beyond, say, the viewership that I'm usually able to get? Now, I have a degree in human psychology. I also have studied a lot of the world's religions and philosophical ideas. And I began wondering, what if there's a tool that, like a psychological tool that can be created and deployed, usable by anybody at will to deal with all the misinformation we face today. And I came up with an idea that I think is completely unique to myself, at least in this application, although I did lift it straight out of Eastern philosophy. But it's called a turning word. Now, turning words are words, I've done a video on this, but turning words are words or phrases that dispel delusions. In the Eastern spiritual sense, they think that we live in Maya, or a world of illusion, and that becoming awakened, you'll see through all that and see things as they are. I can't attest to the reality of enlightenment because I'm just a regular guy. But I thought, in secular terms in the West, politically, we live in Maya. We do live in a world of illusions, gaslit illusions provided by the mainstream media. So there is a lot of similarity there. Now let me give you an example of some turning words. And it starts with the old Eastern story of the monk Gutai. Now Gutai ran a Buddhist monastery, and anytime a visitor would come, and he had this little attendant, this boy that was like 12 years old, and a guest would come and they'd ask Gutai, they would say, "Sir, what is it you teach here at this monastery? What is the fundamental principle of Buddhism?" And all Gutai would ever do is raise his one finger up. And the boy would see this day after day. Well, one day a visitor came and Gutai was out. So the boy went to the front door and the guest said, "You there, boy, what is it you teach here at this monastery? What is the fundamental principle of Buddhism?" And the boy went to raise his finger, and it turns out Gutai was not out. He was hiding behind a curtain, and he jumps out with a knife and he slices off the boy's finger. And the boy, grabs his hand in shock and starts running away. Gutai calls to him, he says, "Hey boy, come back here." And so, the kid comes up holding his hand like, "Oh, what?" And Gutai looks at the boy and asks, "What is the fundamental principle of Buddhism?" And the boy goes to hold up his finger, and it isn't there. And he's enlightened. Now, it's kind of a weird story. You don't know whether to laugh or you get this weird kind of feeling. The idea is these Zen stories, or koans, are supposed to help your mind jump the gap from the conceptual world to direct experience. I don't know, never worked on me, but I never had my finger cut off, the turning words in that case being, what is the fundamental principle of Buddhism, spoken at the appropriate moment when the adept is ready to hear them. But another example of this is the much more familiar, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And you're supposed to, oh, it's nothing. And so I was intrigued by these little tales, and I thought, okay, we live in a world of political illusions. Are there words or phrases that could be deployed by anybody in discussions to dispel delusions rather than the long-winded debates which unfortunately rarely change anybody's mind? Your family dinners break down into CNN talking points versus Fox News talking points. Are there ways in which you can defeat that barrage of talking points and brainwashing? Because the truth is distilled so purely, so absolutely into just a word or a handful of words that can help wake up your would-be opponent and see through their delusions. And because these turning words are reliant on truth, they can never be used for evil or to be deceptive. And to give you some examples in politics, and I think it's an interesting commentary on the struggle between good and evil, truth and lies, because quite often it's been the bad guys, the deceivers, that have accidentally coined these turning words. And there's this idea that evil is often self-defeating, and the first one I would submit to you is fake news. That one became popular, 2015, 2016, was actually coined by CNN in an attempt to maintain narrative control, but they started calling things fake news, and for everyone, it was just like an awakening moment where, like, that's the word we've been looking for to describe what you've been doing all this time, CNN. It was that socially calibrated, in-the-moment response that fit so well. And it got used a lot, but it did wake a lot of people up, like they're just faking the news. Another recent example is the Let's Go Brandon phenomenon. There's people that take kind of simple takes that are like, well, it's not really that funny of a joke. And it's like, it's not a joke. It's a turning word. What they do is reveal, it's not that people are afraid to say the F word. What it does is reveal how the media gaslights us real time, tells us, don't believe your lying eyes, don't believe your lying ears. And that phrase, "Let's go Brandon," is going to change votes. More votes than any amount of political sloganeering or advertising over the next 3 years. Let that sink in, and you can see the power and value of this concept. Now, I have to admit, a somewhat guilty admission here, I use you guys. I A/B test my turning words on my viewership, and I do it all the time, just kind of trying to see if I can get one to catch on, because you don't get to decide, like, well, this is a turning word. Like, it either works or it doesn't work. and that determines whether it's right for the issue at hand. So the latest one I gave to you was this one: it's not an immunization. So when you were going to go home and see your family at Christmas and the inoculations come up and it's, why didn't you get this? Why don't you want to eliminate smallpox kind of thing? And you could simply say, and this is probably all you're going to be able to get in a real-time discussion, it's not an immunization. Those are the turning words, I believe, for that discussion because it traps them. They can either go down one road, which is to say, yes, it is an immunization, and you can say, what about Colin Powell? And they're like, oh, yeah. Or they can say, well, yeah, it's not an immunization, but you should get it anyway, even though it doesn't prevent transmission. And then their entire argument is obviously nonsensical. Another one I've tried pushing out, which really isn't, maybe it's not that good, but it's based on this idea of my HeavyRain political guard, which piggybacks off of what Gene Sharp says, but I believe political power not only comes from institutions, but is fed from cultural roots. So I have the tap root on the right, the very deep but more narrow root that feeds the right political plant, the right-wing culture, which you can seek to develop and grow. And then you have the left-wing culture, which is shallow but more broad and diverse. And that root system from the left gives the left its political capital. And one of the primary sources of political capital I saw getting burned up during the riots of 2020 was all the rage and the anger and the looting. And I thought a lot of this, and I saw it in the signs, the silence is violence stuff, that was Rage Against the Machine. That was Rage Against the Machine lyrics. That cultural force of rage was fed the political possibilities of defund the police. And so I have begun attempting to apply this turning word to them, LARP against the machine. And, Rage Against the Machine is like a multi-million, hundreds of millions of dollars left-wing cultural asset. And so by mocking that, by calling it LARP against the machine, and as their followers affectionately refer to them as rage, I want to be able to someday see them monosyllabically identified with nothing more than the word LARP. I want to make left-wing activism, fist in the air stuff interchangeable both psychologically and linguistically with the lovable dorks who dress up as knights and wizards and stage their mock battles of imaginative importance. So I am always looking for new turning words and trying out new turning words because you can see if you hit one, you really hit the jackpot. There is some serious power here. Now, maybe you don't have a video platform where you can try to push out turning words of your own, but you do have the ability to share memes. Memes in many ways are much the same thing, except they have a picture, and memes reveal truth. It's often said the left can't meme, and when you look at this meme, it's absolutely terrible. It's just a list of talking points. But why is it the left can't meme? The left can't meme because there's no element of truth in what they're trying to say. It's just an obvious attempt to bulwark an establishment-approved narrative. It's not that the right can meme like they have some skill and the left can't. It's one of the abilities you gain when you become a speaker of truth. If you look at this meme, it kind of makes fun of the extreme left and the extreme right. It's just truth. Maybe it's more accurate to say the truth can meme rather than the right can and the left can't. So I think that pretty much wraps it up. I apologize for the length. This is more than I usually do, but there's a lot of new viewers, there's a lot of new subscribers, and I kind of wanted to do a new year overview of what it is I'm trying to do, why I say what I say or do what I do, and why I am hopeful, and how I personally address the question of what can we do? What can the individual person listening to this do? I hope that I've provided at least some food for thought. There is plenty of hope. We've seen much more viciously oppressed people overcome the much more vicious and oppressive open communism. And these are the tools, these are the ideas that I think will be the most effective in helping the individual that is asking themselves, what can I do?